Well, as promised, everyone, today we are talking about the functions of proteins, or what do proteins do? And spoiler alert, the answer is pretty much everything. So proteins, this is why we're talking about them so much, is that for just about everything that we talk about that a cell does, everything happens, whether we say it or not, everything is going to happen because of proteins. The only thing it doesn't really do is carry information. That's what our DNA does. But other than that, uh, pretty much nothing that happens in a cell happens without proteins heavily involved or running the whole thing. Now, you could spend your entire life studying proteins and learning what they do in more and more detail, and I encourage you to do that. That is a great career to go into. But for this class, really, I want you to have some big takeaways just so that you understand as we go through things what you have a better understanding of what the reality is of how amazing cells and how amazing life is. So we're going to talk about several examples of specific types of things that proteins do in cells. Okay, so you'll want to take notes on these. You'll want to have a couple of them written down for reference. But yeah, and then you also need to know that proteins do not. What the one thing they really do not do is they do not carry genetic information. Okay, that's what DNA and RNA do. And then sugars carry energy and store energy. Proteins don't really do that, but they're heavily involved in that process. Okay, and then we're really going to focus on the final um, feature of proteins, a specific function of proteins, and that's called being enzymes or enzymatic reactions as a function. And we really want to understand enzymes, and we'll focus on it of how, again, they're specific, how shape matters. Enzymes are really cool because they're proteins that are reusable. It's great to have something that's useful. It's also even better to have something that you can reuse hundreds or thousands of times. And we're also going to go over some vocabulary that you will want to be aware of. All right, our first function for proteins that we're going to talk about is the function of being a structural or a supportive um, piece of the cell. So if you watch that cell video with the inner life of the cell, you'll see at one point there's all these pieces coming together or going back together, or these big like spider web looking scenes. And those are called the cell skeleton or the microtubules. And essentially, most diagrams or videos or pictures of cells don't include those because they're pretty much everywhere and it would just make everything look too messy. But basically, you need to understand that within what looks like just a glob of water, a bubble of water, there is an amazingly complex skeleton in all three dimensions, and it's all made out of protein. And that those are what allow the cell to have structure, to have the shape that it has, to be able to have support for movement, to be able to move things around. Without the skeleton, just like without your skeleton, you wouldn't be able to do very much. You would not survive. Same thing with individual cells. It's just much, much smaller. And then on the larger scale, things that are made out of proteins are things like our tendons or our ligaments or our skin. Take a chance right now and pull on your skin a little bit. Notice how it doesn't just rip off, which is great. Notice how your skin is kind of bouncy, how it goes back to place. Skin is amazing stuff, and it has a large amount of a certain protein called collagen. And in the picture, I have a zoom up of it. So collagen is when you have a whole bunch of collagen protein molecules, which are made out of peptides or amino acids. And then they get wound up, and those get bundled up, and those get bundled up until you have a bigger and bigger structure. And it's all made out of this super powerful, stable protein called collagen. There are lots of different types of structural proteins, but they all, in some way, will benefit the cell or the animal or plant by providing structure. Here's another function of proteins, and it's the function of contracting, so like pulling in, or being muscles. Many of you probably know that your muscles only move in one direction. If you bend your arm, if you bend your arm in, that's your muscles in your biceps pulling up. And then when you relax your bicep and pull with your tricep, your arm goes down. So muscles are really the fundamental function of a muscle is all built on the proteins. And in this case, it's actually two different types of protein, and they're working together. So there's actin and myosin, um, and maybe you already knew those names, but the big idea is that without protein, we wouldn't have movement, period. And this is important not only for movement, it's also a very, very critical part to how things move within the cell, or how cells go from being one cell to two cells, cell division, which we'll talk about later. When we talk about meiosis and mitosis, if we didn't have muscles to contract, to squeeze, to do this, then we would not have cells being able to replicate themselves. It's absolutely fundamental to how things work. All right, so this one can get a little confusing if you are trying to look at too much detail. For now, you don't need to know all these details, but what you need to know is that just as a result of membranes being semi-permeable, which means only certain things can go through the membrane. And even those things that can get through the membrane aren't necessarily getting through very well or the way that the cell needs them to survive. So there are proteins that will help move things across the membrane. So they're big proteins that will either be set inside or across the membrane. And what they do is they act as a channel, kind of like a bridge going under a river, or a bridge going over a river, I guess. That if you think of the river as being the membrane, the protein is able to take things in from one side, and it has an induced fit. So remember from yesterday, the shape changes, and then it's able to move things inside or outside. And a common type of transport membrane are called ion pumps. So they'll move ions like salt that's been dissolved, which are ions, and they'll move them inside or outside the cell. Without this particular function, none of our brain cells would work. Without these, then you can't think. Without these, you can't move. These are what allow us to think and feel. Without transport proteins, it's game over. Can't do it. Some transport membranes, they don't only move small things like ions, but they'll also move really big things. So let's say you need to get sugar from your bloodstream into your muscles. Well, sugar is too big. Sugar just doesn't fit across those membranes. But proteins can open up and allow and grab sugar and allow sugar from your bloodstream to go into your muscle. Without those proteins, the cell dies. It runs out of sugar and it's game over. And so, yeah, so it can move small things, it can move big things, but without being able to move things more efficiently across the membrane, you just can't create the conditions for life. All right, communication and signaling. So this is where things like insulin come into play. This is where lots of very, very complicated things happen. But basically, it comes down to we have proteins, and there are certain proteins that when a substrate enters them, when something actually fits them, and they get a message, what they do is they release another chemical, they send off something else, and that affects something else, and that affects something else. And there's this big chain reaction or cascade of chemical signals. And ultimately, what it does is it allows the cell to know what's going on outside. So what happens is something touches the outside of the cell, the protein changes shape, the protein sends a message, and ultimately that message results in the cell moving. Okay, so cell proteins can also be used for communication either inside the cell, or proteins can be used for communication or signaling outside the cell. So for example, um, let's say a cell is in danger, it can release chemical proteins to go outside of itself and tell the other cells around it, hey, I'm in danger, you should do something to protect yourself. And so these chemical signals are quite often either proteins themselves or at the very least are received by proteins to allow the cell to respond to its environment. All right, what we have before us is COVID-19, or at least I think it's COVID-19. It's at least some version of COVID. So this is a virus, not a cell, but still this is something that viruses and living things have in common, and it's that they both have proteins. And these proteins in particular, on the outside of the cell or on the outside of a virus, they're used for identification. Every single cell in your body has the same DNA, but they do not all act the same. So how is it that your body knows what is an eye cell and what is a toe cell? Well, the answer is that different cells will make different proteins, and those proteins will be on the surface of them and will let other cells know, hey, I'm an eye cell, or hey, I'm a toe cell, or I'm whatever. And as a result, the body is able to communicate with itself and identify who is who. If you put the cells of another person straight into your body will realize, hey, you have different identifiers, you have different proteins than me, and so I'm going to destroy you because you're not good. Very often, these are in the form of things called glycoproteins. So think of glucose, a sugar. Glycoproteins are sugar proteins, they're combinations that basically act as flags and saying, hey, this is who I am, what I am. And this is how antibodies work. Your body learns to identify this very, very, very specific protein for certain viruses or certain diseases. And then from then on, anytime it notices that specific protein, your body goes after and destroys it. That's how vaccines are developed. That's how our body fights off a large amount of infection. And it's because proteins are extraordinarily shape specific, and cells and viruses use them to identify who and what they are. All right, and so the other functions were important, but you probably won't remember them extremely well, maybe the structural or the muscle ones, but here's where we get down to the nitty gritty. Enzymes. Enzyme is a word you need to know. Enzyme is very big in science and in just understanding how living things live. So in general, an enzyme is a protein that speeds up a chemical reaction. Now, this chemical reaction could be something like breaking apart sugar, or it could be putting something together, like taking a bunch of sugars and making a macromolecule. Okay, enzyme is a very general word, and it means it's going to speed up how fast something happens. There are chemical reactions in our bodies that usually would take hundreds or thousands of years, and they happen in seconds if a protein is involved. It's absolutely amazing. A key point about enzymes is that they are not used up in the reaction. So enzymes help speed up what happens, but they are not actually changed in the end. So they might have an induced fit, they might change shape while the substrate is attached to it, but by the end of the reaction, the enzyme is exactly how it was as it was at the beginning. Only the other chemicals changed. Also, enzymes are extraordinarily shape specific. The substrate, the thing that's going to be changed, can only be a certain shape. And very often, even something extraordinarily similar does not work. Or if it does fit, it causes very big issues. Also, enzymes, because they're shape specific and because proteins can denature depending on their environment, they're very, very, very sensitive to temperature changes. they're sensitive to the environment. So if it's too acidic or not acidic enough, so if you have a fever or if you have too much stomach acid, all of these things can make proteins either work not very well or not work at all. So for example, in the case of a fever, your temperature goes too high, your proteins start denaturing, and as a result, major functions of your cells stop working. You get your brain cells start dying and you die. Fever can be a very, very, very serious thing. Your body has to spend a tremendous amount of energy making sure that you keep all of your environments in the correct range so that your proteins, so that your enzymes can do what they need to do. All right, let's talk a little bit about a whole bunch of enzyme vocabulary. Okay, so catalyst. Catalyst is a great word. I like the word. I don't know why. But catalyst is another word that means to speed up a reaction. However, catalysts are not all proteins. There are many, many, many catalysts that are not proteins. But a protein that is a catalyst, a protein that rather than having the job of being a structural protein like collagen, a protein that has the job of speeding something up is called an enzyme. So enzymes are organic, they're protein catalysts. They're proteins that speed up the reaction. Also, you need to know the substrate. How do you think of that? So substrate, think of sub, like submarine below. The substrate you can think of as the thing that you don't see as much. It's the thing that's less important, but it's the thing that the protein is going to change. So the substrate is the initial thing. It's what you start with. Then the substrate is going to go and attach to the enzyme. It's going to attach to the protein, and it's going to attach not just anywhere. It has to be in a very specific place. That very specific place is called the active site. Okay, so the substrate connects to the active site. In some enzymes, some proteins in general, the protein, just like when we have quaternary proteins, the protein doesn't just work all on its own. Sometimes you need 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different things all working together to get something to actually happen. And these are called cofactors. So ATP, the energy molecule, how our energy runs the cell, is a cofactor. So if you look up here, you have this protein, it's called biotin, and it needs the cofactor, it needs the other thing. So co means to cooperate, to work with it. So a cofactor is something else that works with the enzyme, works with the protein so that it can function. And in the case of ATP, it works with lots and lots of proteins by providing it with the energy it needs to cause chemical reactions. Now, if you had a whole bunch of ATP and a whole bunch of the other molecules and they were just in a container, would they eventually do the chemical reaction? Maybe. But if you have the enzyme, it happens much, 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 much faster. It speeds up the reaction. A coenzyme is the same idea as a cofactor. It's just rather than it being something like ATP, it's another protein, and the two proteins work together to do something. And then reactants and products. So a reactant it's a chemistry word. It means what you start with. A reactant is the thing that is going to react. It's going to react. It is the reactant. So the substrate is often the reactant, same thing. And then what you have at the end, after you've produced everything, after everything is done, being made, you have a product. Just like if you have a product that you want to have sold at the store, you have to finish making it, and then it can go be used. So enzymes will catalyze reactions. They'll speed up chemical reactions on things that are their substrate. And those reactants will change, break apart, or get put together with something else. They will change, and they will become something new that is a product that is ready to be used somewhere else in the cell. Again, you should, just as a recap, have in your mind just a couple of the big functions of proteins and what they do in the cell. So maybe collagen, maybe that ATP synthase from yesterday that makes ATP, um, the muscle proteins for movement. Have in your head just a general idea of that proteins are the things actively doing things. So that's important. Also remember that proteins are not the things that have the information for our cells. That's RNA and DNA. We'll talk about those later. And understand how important enzymes are. They're just absolutely amazing. They're what make possible all of those amazingly fast and specific and accurate chemical reactions in living things that are necessary for us to live, and that they are very, very, very shape specific. So enzymes are specific to certain substrates, okay? But also enzymes, the substrate comes in, it gets changed into a product, but then the enzyme is still an enzyme. The enzyme does not change. It is reusable. And go back and work on that vocabulary, ask me questions about it, and just let me know if you have any questions or any way I can help you. And have a great day.